Hey, welcome back to Mixing Up Success, the podcast for bakers and creative entrepreneurs who want a business that actually works. I'm Dani. I run Dani's Kitchen Shop out of Hood River, Oregon. I've decorated somewhere north of 160,000 cookies at this point, and today it's just you and me. Just a conversation I wish someone had sat me down and had with me back when I was standing in my kitchen, wondering if I was crazy for even thinking about this. So, here's what we're doing for the next 3 episodes. I'm calling it a mini series, and it's really about the 3 things that showed up over and over in my inbox, in my direct messages, in the comments on every single post where I talk about starting a bakery. 3 things that keep talented bakers, people who can make things that genuinely make people cry tears of joy, stuck at maybe someday instead of I sell cookies. Today, we're starting at the very beginning. What's actually holding you back from selling your baked goods? Not the cottage food law, not the lack of a website, the real thing, the thing underneath the thing. I've faced every single one of these. I'm going to walk you through what they looked like for me and, more importantly, what I learned about them. Because knowing you're not the only one who feels this way is nice, but what you actually need is a way through it. So let's get into it. Before I do, let me tell you a little bit about how I even got here, because I think it matters for what's coming. I'm a mom. I'm a farmer's wife. I live out on an orchard in Hood River, Oregon, and none of this started with a business degree or some grand 5-year plan. It started the way it probably started for a lot of you listening. People kept asking me to bring something to every gathering, a birthday, a potluck, a holiday party. Someone would take one bite and say, completely unprompted, "You should really sell these." And I'd laugh it off, the way you probably have too, and go back to my regular life. That comment sat there for a long time before I did anything with it. Years, actually. So if that's where you are right now, if you've been hearing some version of you should sell these for a while and just filing it away, I want you to know I understand exactly why you haven't acted on it yet. I sat on it too. Let's talk about why. Let me take you back. December of 2018. I'm standing in my kitchen, my actual home kitchen, not some commercial space, not a dream kitchen, my regular kitchen with regular appliances. And I make this decision. On January 1st, I'm going to start selling cookies. That's it. That is the whole plan. I didn't have a logo. I didn't have a website. I definitely didn't have a commercial kitchen. What I had was a product I loved making and a decision. And I want to be honest with you about what the weeks leading up to that decision actually felt like, because it wasn't confidence. It was not me feeling ready. It was me feeling completely underqualified and doing it anyway. Because the alternative, staying stuck, had started to feel worse than the fear. So let's talk about the 3 things that were sitting on my chest that December: imposter syndrome, the overwhelm of just starting, and the fear of failing publicly in front of people who know me. If you're feeling any one of these right now, I want you to really hear this. You are not behind. You're not missing some gene that other bakers have. You're standing exactly where I stood, and I got through to the other side. So can you. Let's start with imposter syndrome, because I think this one is the quietest one and honestly the sneakiest. Here's what it sounds like in your head. Who am I to charge money for this? There are actually professional bakers out there, people who went to culinary school, people with commercial kitchens and years of experience. And here I am with my home oven thinking I can charge $25 a dozen for cookies. What if someone asks me a question I don't know the answer to? What if I'm just not that good and everyone's been too nice to tell me? I lived in that voice for a long time. And here's the thing nobody tells you about imposter syndrome. It doesn't go away when you get good. I have baked well over 160,000 cookies. I've taught more than 1,300 students. I still, on certain days, catch that voice trying to whisper that I'm going to get found out. So if you're waiting to feel like a real baker before you start selling, I need you to hear me. That feeling might not show up. Not because you're not good enough, because that's not how confidence actually works. Confidence doesn't come before the action. It comes after it. You don't think your way into feeling like a real bakery owner. You act your way into it. You take one order. You fulfill it well. And something in you shifts just slightly. You take another. It shifts a little more. Confidence is built the exact same way you built your baking skill, one rep at a time, not by sitting in your kitchen waiting to feel ready. Here's what actually helped me. I stopped asking, am I good enough to sell this? And I started asking a completely different question. Is this good enough for the person who's going to eat it? Because that's the actual bar, not am I as good as a bakery with a storefront and 15 years in business? The bar is, does this product delight the person eating it? If you already know the answer to that, and if people have been telling you you should sell these for years, you already know the answer. Then the gap isn't your skill. The gap is your permission. And I'm telling you right now, as someone a few years further down this road, you have permission. You had it before you hit play on this episode. The other thing that helped me was getting specific about what qualified actually requires where I live, not what the internet says a real bakery looks like. What my actual state's cottage food rules say I'm allowed to sell from my actual kitchen. Because a lot of imposter syndrome is really just fear wearing a costume made of vague, underdefined standards. The second you replace, am I good enough with an actual checklist, a legal structure, a cottage food registration, a product that's allowed where you live, the fear has a lot less room to hide. It becomes concrete, and concrete things you can just do. I want to give you one more tool for this because it's the one I still use to this day when that voice gets loud. I call it the receipts test. Instead of arguing with the feeling, because you cannot logic your way out of the feeling, I've tried, I go find the evidence. Every single time someone asks me to make something for a birthday, a wedding, an office party, every single time someone said, you should really sell these, every compliment I brushed off with an, oh, it's nothing, instead of a simple thank you, that's not nothing. That's data. That's the world already telling you the answer to, am I good enough? And imposter syndrome is just you refusing to believe evidence that's already sitting right in front of you. So if you're in that spot right now, I want you to actually do this, not just nod along in your car. Think of 3 times someone reacted to your baking in a way that surprised you with how much they loved it. Just 3. That's your receipts test. That's your proof. It existed before this podcast episode, and it's still true after it. Okay, second thing, the overwhelm of starting a business. This one is real, and I don't want to talk you out of it because it's not irrational. Starting a business genuinely does require you to figure out a pile of things you've never had to think about before. Business structure, cottage food laws in your state, pricing, which, side note, we're doing an entire episode on in a couple weeks because pricing overwhelm deserves its own conversation. Instagram, whether you need a website, what to even put on the menu. Is it genuinely a lot? And if you sat down and tried to map out everything a real business might eventually need, you would close the laptop and go make cookies for your neighbors instead, which honestly, some days is the better use of your evening. Here's what I did with the overwhelm. And it is the single most useful shift I made in that entire process. I stopped trying to build the whole business. I picked one day and I said, on this day, I launch. Not when everything's ready, not once I've researched enough, a specific date, January 1st. That date did something the research never could. It forced me to stop gathering information and start making decisions. Because here's what overwhelm actually is underneath the feeling. Overwhelm is what happens when you're holding 15 open decisions in your head at the same time and none of them are getting made. Your brain isn't built to hold 15 open loops. It's built to handle them one at a time in order. The moment I gave myself a deadline, all 15 of those vague, floating things I should figure out eventually turned into a much shorter, much more specific list of things I need to decide by January 1st. And a specific list, even a slightly scary one, is so much easier to move through than an infinite fuzzy one. The other thing I want to tell you, because it's the piece that actually let me move fast, you do not need 10 products to launch. I picked 1 to 3. That's it. Not because I lacked ambition, because starting focused is the actual smart move. You do not need a website. You do not need a logo. You do not need a commercial kitchen. I launched with none of those things. What you need is 1 to 3 products you already make well, confirmation of what your state allows you to sell from home, and a way for someone to place an order. Even if that way is a text message. If you're sitting there with a list of 40 things you think you need before you can start, I want you to imagine cutting that list down to 4 things. What you're selling, whether it's legal, where you are, what it costs to make, and what you'll charge, and how someone tells you what they want. That's it. That's the launch. Everything else, the brand, the website, the fancy packaging, that stuff can come later. And honestly, some of it comes together so much better once you actually have real customers giving you real feedback, instead of guessing what they'll want from inside your own head. I also want to say something about the difference between researching and deciding, because I think this is where so many bakers quietly get stuck for months, sometimes years, without realizing that's what's happening. Researching feels productive. You're reading blog posts, you're watching videos, you're scrolling through other bakers' Instagram pages, taking mental notes. It feels like progress because you're doing something. But research without a deadline just becomes a very sophisticated way of staying safe. It lets you feel like you're moving toward the business without ever having to risk actually starting it. Deciding is different. Deciding is uncomfortable because deciding means you might be wrong. But deciding is the only thing that actually moves you forward. Somewhere in your overwhelm right now, there is probably a decision you've been researching instead of just making. I'd bet money on it. What is it? Sit with that for a second because naming it is most of the battle. Here's the practical version of everything I just said, boiled down to what I actually did in the weeks before January 1st. I picked my launch date first, before anything else was figured out. Then I worked backward. Week 1 of that runway, I chose my 1 to 3 products. Week 2, I looked up my state's cottage food rules and wrote down in plain language exactly what I could and could not sell. Week 3, I did rough pricing math, not perfect, just enough to not lose money on day 1. And in the final days, I wrote one simple message I could send to everyone who asked how to order. That was the entire plan. 4 decisions, each with its own small window instead of one giant paralyzing pile. Third thing, and this might be the biggest one for a lot of you listening, the fear of failing. I want to be really honest about this one because I think a lot of business content glosses over it, and it deserves to be named directly. The fear of failing at a bakery business isn't really the fear of losing money, at least not at first. It's the fear of failing in front of people who know you, your neighbors, your sister-in-law who's already skeptical, the friend from church who's watching to see if this is a real thing or just a phase. There's a very specific flavor of dread that comes with the idea of announcing you're starting a business and then having it not work out where everyone can see. I felt every bit of that. I want you to know that too. Because I think sometimes when people hear 160,000 cookies, 10 plus years in business, it can sound like I skipped the scary part. I didn't. I stood in that kitchen in December of 2018, fully aware that this could not work, that I could put myself out there and it could just fizzle. That was on the table the entire time. Here's what got me past it. Failure isn't the opposite of a business plan. Failure is what happens when you have no plan and no way to learn from what happened. If you launch with a real plan, 1 to 3 products, your pricing figured out with actual math instead of a guess, one marketing channel instead of trying to be everywhere, and it doesn't go the way you hoped, that's not failure. That's data. That's information about what to adjust. The only way to actually fail at this is to never start, because then you get 0 data and 0 movement forever. I also want to gently push back on the story that a slow start means it's not working. My first month selling cookies did not look like my business does now. Of course they didn't. Years of experience, thousands of students, an entire framework I teach other bakers now, none of that existed on January 2nd of 2019. What existed on January 2nd was one order. That's all a beginning has to be. One order fulfilled. You are not being graded against year 10. You're not even being graded against month 6. You're being graded against whether you took the next right step today in front of you. And here's the practical piece that made fear of failure so much smaller for me. I built a real marketing plan for exactly 1 week, not a year-long strategy. 1 week, 1 channel, 3 posts, 10 personal conversations with people I already knew. That's genuinely enough to get your first orders. When the ask in front of you is 3 posts and 10 conversations, fear of failure doesn't have nearly as much room to operate because the task is small, specific, and finishable by Friday. Fear grows in vague, giant spaces. It shrinks a lot when you hand it something small and concrete to do instead. I want to give you one more reframe here because it's the one I come back to more than any other on the hard days, even now, 10 plus years in. Ask yourself what the actual worst case is, not the vague dread, the specific, named worst case. For me, back in December of 2018, the worst case was I make a batch of cookies, I post about it, nobody orders, and I've spent maybe $40 on ingredients and a Saturday afternoon. That was it. That was the actual worst case. When I forced myself to name it instead of just feeling it, $40 in an afternoon, and then I'd know something I didn't know before. When you actually write down the worst case instead of letting it stay a shapeless dread in the back of your mind, it almost always turns out to be survivable. Usually it turns out to be downright small. Try this yourself this week. Write down your actual worst case in specific terms and see if it really is as big as it is feeling. So let's zoom out for a second because I want to tie these 3 things together because they're actually not separate problems. Imposter syndrome, overwhelm, and fear of failing, they're all the same root thing wearing different outfits. They're all what happens when you're standing at the edge of something without a plan in your hands. When all you have is a swirl of what ifs and no next concrete step, of course it feels paralyzing. Of course it does. Anyone would freeze in that spot. The thing that got me out of that kitchen and into an actual business wasn't more confidence. It wasn't waking up one morning suddenly fearless. It was a plan, a specific, written down, here's exactly what I'm going to do and by when plan. Once I had that in front of me instead of just swirling around in my head, the fear didn't disappear completely, but it stopped running the show. I could feel scared and still take the next step because the next step was small and clear instead of enormous and vague. And I think that's really the heart of what I want to talk to you about today. You don't need to feel ready. You don't need the fear to go away first. You need a plan small enough to act on today, even while the fear is still sitting right next to you. I get asked all the time, usually by someone messaging me late at night when the doubt is loudest. How did you actually know it was the right time to start? And the honest answer is I didn't know. There was no signal, no moment where the clouds parted and I suddenly felt certain. What I had was a decision I made anyway. On a random Tuesday in December, standing at my counter, tired of the idea living in my head. If you're waiting for certainty before you begin, I need to gently tell you it's not coming. Not because something is wrong with you, because certainty is not how this works for anyone, including the bakers you're comparing yourself to right now who look like they've got it all figured out. They didn't either. They just started before they felt ready. The same way I'm asking you to. So here's what I want to invite you to. On August 27th, I'm running a live workshop called Build Your Bakery Business Plan in a Day. It's live on Zoom and it runs for about 90 minutes, 11 a.m. to 12:30 Pacific. And I built it to be the exact thing I didn't have back in December of 2018. We're going to sit down together live and build your actual bakery business plan. Not a rough idea, not another Pinterest board, a real written plan, module by module, while we're on the call together. By the time we hang up, you will have chosen your legal structure. You'll have narrowed in on your 1 to 3 signature products. You'll have your state's cottage food rules written down in plain language. You'll have an order email template ready to send the next time someone asks how to order. You'll have your pricing done using an actual formula, not a guess. And you'll walk away with a 7-day launch checklist day by day so you know exactly what to do next in order without the overwhelm feeling of 15 tabs being open. And here's my favorite part. At the end, you get to ask me anything live. Whatever's specific to your situation, your kitchen, your state, your product, bring it and we'll talk through it together. I built this workshop specifically for the version of you that's been sitting on this idea for a while now, maybe months, maybe years, with the recipes tested, the feedback from friends and family already glowing, and just no plan connecting I can bake to I sell baked goods. That gap is the whole workshop. We're closing it in 90 minutes together live. You don't need to prepare anything beforehand. You don't need to have your product decided or your state's rules looked up already. We do all of that together on the call. You just need to show up with your calendar cleared for 90 minutes and a willingness to make a few real decisions instead of gathering more information. If any part of today's episode hit close to home, if you're sitting on this idea for months or years, if you've got people telling you you should sell these, if the only thing standing between you and your first order is a plan you can actually act on, this is it. Head over to dannyskitchenshop.com/build-your-business and you'll see the button for the live session right on that page. Grab your seat for August 27th. I would love to build this with you live together. Before I let you go, next episode, we're talking about pricing, specifically the moment I realized I had been guessing at my numbers for years and what it actually took to fix that. If you've ever quoted a price and then had this little nagging feeling that you just made that number up, this coming episode is for you. Until then, you don't have to feel ready. You just have to take the next small step. I'll see you back here in a week. This has been Mixing Up Success from Dani's Kitchen Shop. If this episode helped you, I'd love it if you could subscribe and share it with a baker in your life who needs to hear it. I'll talk to you next week.